Cold War, one of the most important wars of the 20th century. We call it Cold War because the two sides never declared war on each other. Instead, they set up proxy governments or anti-government forces all over the world. As a result, many countries fell into civil war or worse, were divided. The three countries above are just three of the most typical wars. In 1991, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Vietnam and Germany in one way or another successfully unified. But the two parts of the Korean peninsula were not so lucky. 70 years since the war ended, we have heard a lot about the two sides of North Korea. To the south, it is a miraculous development and a technological power in the world. And here is what we hear about the north.
This morning, North Korea launching 4 new missile tests.
New missile launches overnight by North Korea.
North Korea has conducted dozens of missile tests this year.
You wonder why North Korea is so obsessed with nuclear weapons.
그 어떤 극난한 환경에 처한다 해도 미국이 조성해 놓은 조선반도의 정치 군사적 형세 하에서
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens.
Pyongyang sees the test launch as a clear warning to its quote-unquote enemies.
States like these constitute an axis of evil.
The war took place in 1950, but to understand the origin of this story you have to go back to 1895, when the whole Korean peninsula, as a unified country, was under the tributary system of China. But by the end of the 19th century, China was too weak. While another neighbor of Korea, after a series of reforms, was rising strongly, they wanted to replace China to become the dominant power in Asia. Korea was sandwiched between an old power that was dying and a new, ambitious power that was rising. So when war broke out between them, Korea was brought in as a commodity to be brought to the gambling table. China lost, and China had to accept to give Korea to Japan. China had fallen out of the war for influence in this peninsula, so another power wanted to jump into the dispute. But Russia was not that strong. Japan continued to defeat Russia to be alone on the Korean peninsula. In 1910, the Japanese Empire completed the annexation of Korea. For the next 35 years, the Korean peninsula was still Japan's, and the Korean people were not happy with this, but they could not do anything. I mean, what could they do against the most powerful empire at that time? So they needed someone to help drive out the Japanese, someone even stronger than the Japanese. In 1945, the US and its allies defeated Japan. They decided that Japan had to return all the lands they had occupied. Korea was one of them. So the two allies took responsibility for the Korean peninsula. This is when things started to go wrong. The Soviet Union and the US decided to divide Korea into two camps for 5 years until Korea could hold elections and form a unified state. How did the Soviet Union and the US plan to divide Korea? They didn't use rivers, mountains, culture, or ethnicity. These two American men put a map on the table and drew a straight line dividing the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel north. Why 38? Simply because the Americans wanted the capital of North Korea, Seoul, under their control. However, the Americans were not sure that their proposal would be accepted by the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, agreed to this. After World War II, despite their disagreements, Stalin still aimed for peaceful coexistence with the Americans and the West. So he quickly agreed to this proposal. The Soviets would station troops in the north, and the Americans would station troops in the south. Did the North Koreans like this? Of course not. But then again, what could they do against the world's greatest superpowers? After dividing the Korean peninsula, not long after, the Soviet Union and the United States realized that the other was not their friend and started a new war, the Cold War. The situation in Korea was also tense, following the Soviet Union and the United States could not find a common voice for elections for the entire peninsula. Instead, they put up pro-government governments on both sides. In 1948, the South organized its own elections and elected Ri Syngman as president, establishing the Republic of Korea, abbreviated as South Korea. Shortly after, the North, which belonged to the Soviet Union, also put Kim Il-sung as leader. After having arranged the two pro-government governments, in 1949, both the Soviet Union and the United States withdrew from the Korean peninsula, leaving a lot of instability for this place. Kim Il-sung, the communist man, was a warmonger. He seemed to have inherited these qualities from Mao Zedong during his time serving the Communist Party of China. Kim Il-sung was determined to unify the entire peninsula by force. There were many communist uprisings in the south, some spontaneous, some supported by Kim Il-sung. He believed that these were weakening the government of Ri Syngman, and a war began to form in his mind. After the American troops withdrew from Korea, Kim Il-sung saw this as an opportunity for a war. Kim Il-sung went to Moscow to ask Stalin about organizing a war to unify the country. Why ask Stalin? Because Stalin at that time was like the big boss of communism, so to organize the war, Kim Il-sung had to get Stalin's permission. In addition, although he was very confident, Kim Il-sung also knew that he could not defeat Ri Syngman without the help of the Soviet Union. But when he opened his mouth to Stalin, Kim Il-sung immediately received the answer, no. Stalin did not want the Soviet Union to be dragged into the war with the US. Moreover, in China, Mao Zedong was fighting fiercely with Chiang Kai-shek. For Stalin, China was enough, and adding North Korea, he could not bear it, so Kim Il-sung left disappointed. But a year later in 1950, Stalin changed his mind. Why? Because the Soviet Union now had nuclear weapons. Stalin was no longer afraid of America, or at least not afraid that America would come to attack him anymore, because China was finally unified under Mao Zedong's communist flag, and because Stalin received intelligence from America that America did not take the Korean peninsula very seriously. If Kim Il-sung launched a war, this would certainly be an easy victory. Stalin stroked his beard and thought, but to be sure, when allowing Kim to carry out the war, Stalin added a sentence: "We will not directly participate in the war. If you want support, ask Mao Zedong." Kim Il-sung went to see Mao Zedong again, and Mao repeated exactly what Stalin said when they met in Moscow. "No, we don't want to be dragged into a war with America." Stalin went to see Mao Zedong and said, "Comrade Mao, please help Comrade Kim. I will help you economically and militarily." Mao wasn't very excited about the first part, but when he heard the second part, Mao's eyes lit up. After the war, China was just a pile of rubble, so Mao really needed Stalin's support. Mao nodded to Kim and was ready to go into World War. So on June the 25th, 1950,
a highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed.
The invasion of the Korean peninsula and the US was unexpected. This is the map we know today after the Korean War ended. But there was a time when it looked like this. US President Harry S. Truman began to panic and turn around on the Korean
peninsula. The future of civilization depends on what we do now.
According to Truman, this was not Kim Il-sung's invasion. This was the Soviet Union's invasion.
This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union.
He allowed the U.S. Army to go to Korea and mobilized the U.S. Army stationed in Japan to help Ri Syngman. The U.S. Army and its allies went crazy. The Koreans bombed everything they could in the north. In the end, 635,000 tons of bombs were dropped. To put this number into perspective, it was larger than the total number of bombs that the U.S. dropped on the Pacific Front in World War II, and was only less than Laos and Vietnam. The situation had reversed. Now Kim Il-sung's army was the one being surrounded. China was forced to join the war. They successfully pushed back the US and its allies. Was this because of a promise to North Korea, or was China wanting to protect its northeastern border, or both? We don't know, but without China's intervention and effectiveness, there might not have been a DPRK like today, and the story would have ended here. The war continued until 1953, until the party sat down at the negotiating table and signed an armistice agreement. Around the 138th parallel north, the two sides established a buffer zone called the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, with North Korea controlling this line and South Korea controlling this line. After the war, the two sides began to follow different paths. The US military remained in the southern part of the peninsula to protect South Korea. They even placed their nuclear warheads in South Korea to increase the threat to North Korea. From here, South Korea began to develop its economy, rising from one of the poorest countries in the world to become one of the four dragons of the Asian economy. What did North Korea do during that time? In stark contrast to its southern cousin, North Korea recovered very quickly in the early post-war period with no small amount of help and massive aid from its two neighbors. But then growth began to stagnate and was eventually surpassed by South Korea. This stagnation was partly a result of the split between the Soviet Union and China. Like Vietnam, North Korea leaned toward the Soviet Union, causing China to cut off much of its aid to North Korea. But most importantly, North Korea had to sacrifice its economy to protect the nation. Unlike the South, they were not protected by allies as much as the US protected South Korea, and they were not allowed to have nuclear weapons placed on their territory by the Soviet Union. They were haunted by the destruction from outside forces, but did not have enough necessary support to avoid repeating what happened in the past. North Korea chose to prioritize national defense, and this is when they thought about nuclear weapons. Most of us often think that North Korea's nuclear program started in the 90s, but the leaders of North Korea thought about this destructive weapon much earlier. Mr. Kim's purpose is very simple. Once they have them, North Korea will have more weight in international politics. And the enemy did not dare to invade North Korea. From the 50s, just a few years after the war ended, Kim Il-sung asked the Soviet Union for nuclear weapons production technology, but this request was rejected. Instead, the Soviet Union helped North Korea build nuclear plants for civilian purposes. Kim found these things okay. Even if he did not develop nuclear weapons, the North Koreans would learn and be trained in atomic energy. Everything began to change from the 80s. China turned to the US, and the Soviet Union began to weaken seriously. Along with the miraculous growth of South Korea, North Korea felt threatened. So Kim Il-sung began to launch a nuclear weapons program in the 80s. Kim Il-sung's fears came true. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, oil and energy aid disappeared. But more dangerously, the Soviet nuclear umbrella that protected North Korea for so many years also disappeared. The only thing left was Kim Il-sung's unfinished nuclear weapons program, and North Korea clung to it at all costs. Although it joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Program in 1985 and signed the Nuclear Disarmament Agreement with the United States in 1994, North Korea never really complied with them. The situation began to worsen when the U.S. shifted its policy to
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens.
Kim Il-sung's son Kim Jong-un stood from Pyongyang and watched the U.S. overthrow Saddam Hussein in the blink of an eye because he thought he had weapons of mass destruction.
United States military forces captured Saddam Hussein alive.
Then he saw Gaddafi believe the US's words to give up nuclear weapons, and finally suffer the same fate as Saddam Hussein. Kim Jong-un feared that the US with its power could continue to do the same to North Korea. Kim Jong-un saw no reason to give up the only thing that could protect him. Kim Jong-un, the third generation of the Kim family, still maintained this stance.
조선반도의 정치 군사적 형세 하에서
Now we hear more and more about North Korea's nuclear weapons tests around the Sea of Neighbors, or how North Korea's nuclear weapons have been improved. They appear densely on TV and media, but whether North Korea uses them for offensive purposes to unify the Korean peninsula, or just to avoid these terrible memories from repeating, no one knows. But looking at what has happened in the two Koreas as of now, only one thing is certain. We can know that 70 years have passed. This peninsula has been divided and will be divided for a long time. People with the same culture, the same language, even the same family are still hindered by this border.